Good morning. How's everybody doing? All right. So welcome to the Hagerty Seminar Series at this year's Concours of America, and this is the Emerging Collectibles Seminar. And just by way of housekeeping, this particular discussion is going to go until 10:15, and then we have another seminar starting promptly again at 10:30 about factory drag cars. And all of you guys are welcome and encouraged to stay for that as well. We'll have a quick 15-minute changeover and continue on with that. Just by way of housekeeping, as far as how this format is going to work, there will be a question and answer session at the end of the discussion, but if there is something that you're burning to know that's pertinent to what's being discussed at the moment, feel free to ask a question, and our moderator will accommodate that. So it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Jonathan Stein. He is the executive editor of Hagerty Classic Car Magazine, and prior to that, he had a long career, about 12 years with Automobile Quarterly Magazine. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan Stein.
Didn't my son do a great job? Well, thank you for joining us. We are really lucky to have this panel here today. The market is changing, and these are people who really are at the thick of it. They know what's going on with the changes. We've got Myron Vernis, who is this incredible collector of the most interesting cars. If you read a story in a magazine or newspaper about a car you've never heard of that's bizarre and fascinating, it probably belongs to Myron, who by his own account has owned well over 400 cars. Then there's Dave Kinney. Many of you know him. He's the publisher and founder of what is the Hagerty Price Guide. He's a world-renowned expert on the market. He's an ASA appraiser. How many cars have you owned, do you figure, Dave?
My number's probably similar to Myron's, but I started at an early age. My first car was 5 Plymouth Valiants.
Your first car. We've got Alan Squindo with RM. He's vice president there. If you go to the auction, you will hear him narrating, explaining the cars. He's had exposure to thousands and thousands of amazing cars. He hasn't owned as many as Dave or Myron, but the guy's only 30, so you've got to give him a break. And then we have Rob Sass, my former boss at Hagerty. He's now at Crane Communications, written for lots of magazines. He claims he's owned 50 cars, but based on the time I've known him, the 5 or 6 years, he's probably owned 25 then, so I think it's probably more like 150. So be real, Rob. Now, what we really want to know is what market segments are changing. Where are people collecting that they weren't 10, 15, 20 years ago, because demographics are changing. So who are the collectors and what do they want? Let's start with, just work down the road and we'll get them to interact, and hopefully you won't have to listen to much of me as we move forward. Myron, what is a market, an area of cars that you see as emerging that's new in the last few years that you see having a future?
You know, the area that has interested me and has gotten me most excited is Japanese cars. You hear people talk about JDM cars, not necessarily all cars that are just for the Japanese domestic market, but there were some really, really great cars that we neglected. You know, I say that the Japanese did with their cars like the French do with their wine. You know, they keep the best stuff for themselves. And in the news over the last couple of years, you know, everyone seen the $1 million Toyota 2000 GTs, most recently the Hakusuka and Kenmari GTR, Skyline GTRs, and the Fairlady Z432s, which there'll be one on the show field tomorrow. You know, the ship has sailed on those very, very high-end cars, but there are a lot of really great Japanese cars that are still accessible, that have a great future. Say like the Toyota 2000 GT, built by Yamaha for Toyota, the engine built and designed by Yamaha for Toyota. Everyone knows about that. They're $1 million cars, 300 some made. What people don't know, there was a 1600 GT Again, built by Yamaha, the engine built and designed by Yamaha. But to most people, it looks like a Corona. Has the same transmission as a 2000 GT, same interior. But instead of $1 million car, when you can find them, and they do become available, they're $30,000 to $35,000 cars. So the market is heavy with that. Now, you have to find the cars because they're fairly rare. And the Japanese, again, don't like to let those cars get away. But there's great opportunity there. And the cars that we got here, first generation Celicas, all the way through into the mid-'80s. Very well built cars. Survival is very good, and they run, 100, 200,000 miles like they should. So
But we don't see many here in Detroit.
we don't see many in Detroit.
I'd like to continue down the line and see, Dave, what new markets do you see based on the changing buyer, the changing participant?
Well, actually, one thing that I've been kind of following really closely recently has been the last series Firebird and its Camaro twin. We love to think that that's not a great car, and it is a great car. The styling on the Firebirds can be a little off-putting to some people. They had that kind of outrageous nose to them and front end, but I think there's some tremendous bargains in those. And when you're talking about things like the Firehawk and a number of the Indy Pace Car edition of that not final series of Camaros, I think there's some great opportunities there. They're a usable, drivable car. They have kind of enough room for small kids in the back seat. They're really pretty much a two-passenger car. But there's a lot of them out there that are changing hands right now that are original owner or maybe two-owner cars, and I think there's some really great opportunities there. I saw one in Denver. It wasn't a Firehawk, but a final year Firebird with reasonable miles and a very, very clean car that sold for $7,500. And I think that's that's a price point that almost everybody can afford, and I think that's a price point that's not going to last for a long time.
Yeah, I would second that, Dave. The last year, the 35th anniversary Camaros, the end of the line for that generation of F-body, pretty interesting cars, and just at price points right now that are really just surprising. Just what you can get for $15,000 or less in a Camaro or Firebird from a fourth generation car is pretty amazing.
And they're appealing to people who still have their original hair, so it's generations down. So.
I think a lot of that has to do as well with the same criteria that you look at with cars from the 50s and 60s. Is the car rare? Was it a first-year model? Is it very well equipped? Are the colors really attractive on it? Just 2 nights ago, speaking of American muscle cars, I had a conversation with a gentleman at the Automotive Hall of Fame dinner for about a half an hour about the first year of Dodge Viper, a very, very rare car. I think right there is a car that you can keep an eye on because they don't come up very often.
And they're cheap.
And they're cheap right now. And I think there's a lot of examples of that kind, but I think...
and there's 2 of them that haven't been abused.
Yeah, and I think
making it even more rare, that's the option spin right there.
I think that's the key, though, is finding the best examples you possibly can, especially at this point.
Yeah, and the Viper is a very special car. It's amazing that in 1992, you had a car with a V10 and side curtains instead of roll-up windows, and just a very minimalist car, very much in the vein of the 427 Cobra. The fact that it happened at all is just astonishing, and they're way too cheap right now.
But it is interesting that the categories that the 4 of us have listed, perhaps aside from some of the earlier Japanese cars from the 60s, they all seem to also signify a bit of a generational trend as well. It's one that we see in the auction business as well.
You signify the generational shift.
and generally, we've always determined, and through our market research as well, that 55 to 65 really is our target audience for classic cars. But that 55 and 65-year-old was in college now, at this point in 2015, in a whole different decade. And so, as you like to say, the dorm room poster example, I think it's probably one of...
Yeah, exactly. I mean, everybody in the early 80s was into cars had a poster of a Lamborghini Countach, a Ferrari Testarossa, a Porsche slant-nose turbo, and for a long time those cars were just really sort of, kind of 80s artifacts, kind of almost caricatures. But guess what? Those people are now pushing 50, they have disposable income, and those cars are hitting catalog sales, whereas, you would not see those at big auctions 5 or 10 years ago. You're certainly seeing them now. Amelia Island, at RM sale, you had a lot of them, and they're bringing very, very good money now.
I think when you, if you're looking for an emerging collectible, that's really, really key. You have to, talk to the person who, it might not be something that immediately is your appeal, but it might be a generation or two down. And as far as Japanese cars go, you can't even go wrong with a good Supra or Celica, even if it wasn't a JDM car, even if it was something that came to the United States. There are some that are more on top of the heap than others. But we can't forget things like Rob was just mentioning the GLH.
The Omni.
Dodge Omni.
The Shelby GLHS.
There are a lot of cars that when Shelby left Ford and went to Dodge that they produced in very, very small numbers. And I've seen a few of them sell recently for really amazingly cheap money.
Yeah.
And nice cars as well. So, I mean, there's those kind of things to look out for. They might not have made a big impact when new, but they had the great graphics, the wild colors and all that. And, even though you think maybe you don't want to drive in a, bright lime green, whatever, that's what the market sometimes likes because it's representative of the most outrageous one from its generation. Rob,
Yeah.
what were your picks? And Alan, too. So.
Well, actually, before we started, we were talking about, oddly enough, Buick Regal T-Types, Grand Nationals, and GNXs, and it seems odd to talk about those cars in the context of an emerging market, but the fact of the matter is the best days of those cars are probably in front of them. They've always been collectible. They've always had a following, but the people who really wanted them when they were new but couldn't afford them are now just starting to come into a fair amount of disposable income. So the best days of cars like that are probably still in front of them.
In my opinion, I'd say air-cooled Porsche 911s. They're very traditional, but their price point was generally hovering for some run-of-the-mill models, from standard models around the $15,000 mark. Some really great examples might get to $40,000, $50,000, $60,000. And we have one in this sale coming up later today, and it's extraordinary. It probably has more attention and interest and registered bidders on it than any car in the auction. It's a 930 turbo from the last year of production. So I think that car, air-cooled 911s, are ones to keep an eye on, but I should emphasize that the auction business can at times be an extreme example of where prices are going. You have a wide spread for air-cooled Porsches. Our goal with only having 80 cars in a sale is to bring the very best examples, the rarest colors, first of, last of, turbos, and so on and so forth. But with an air-cooled 911, you could start at probably about $15,000, $20,000 and work your way up with recent records. I think you said you saw one at 300 plus on a turbo. So that's one market, again, that kind of highlights, I think, people that were growing up in the 80s that have an interest in those cars. And as cars get, to my mind, very technically advanced with paddle shifters and a lot of computer interference, I think collectors are looking for a more visceral driving experience.
Yeah, and I think that probably explains, speaking of 80s cars, the really recent jump in 80s Ferraris like Ferrari 308s, because those cars kind of represent the last of the cars where, if you want a vintage Ferrari, you can actually afford to maintain it, and you're not necessarily buying into the whole Ferrari ecosystem of dealer service and very expensive parts. So I would agree with you 100%. That probably is what represents a good amount of the appreciation in cars from that era. They really do kind of represent the last of the cars you can wrench on yourself.
I think you could take that to the ultimate end of that, too. I have a friend who's a dealer in Ohio who's kind of found a niche and a specialty in selling the last of the big GM rear-wheel drive cars. Low mileage examples, the typical little old lady cars. But he's selling, 70s, early 80s Oldsmobile sedans for $15,000 to $20,000.
Roadmaster wagons.
And
As soon as,
wagons,
whenever
yeah,
those hit the
exactly.
market, a clean rear-wheel drive Roadmaster wagon goes immediately. So yeah, it's funny. I mean, you sometimes have to look for your niches. That if you hadn't brought it up, Myron, that might not have occurred to me. But those are extremely popular.
Yeah, we not only the I kind of like what I'm looking at right now are some of the, and when I say special editions, I don't mean those cars that were built as special editions normally, but there are always cars that that they were going to produce more of but didn't. And in the typical General Motors fashion, when they get something right, they kill it. The Pontiac Solstice is a perfect example, as well as the Saturn Sky. I can say that because Rob does have a Ferrari in the 308. He's got a 328. I have a Solstice with 650 miles on it. It's the first year of it. It's not taken off now, and it'll take a while to do it. But there were some exceptional cars that were built and especially the in the Pontiac line, the GTO, which was a Holden in Australia. Those cars are going to count a lot at some point.
The G8 with a manual transmission probably will, but I'm surprised you didn't mention in terms of Solstices the Gxp Coupes, the ones that were built literally right before the bankruptcy, right before they shut down the plant in Delaware. I believe they only built 900 of them, and they are absolutely drop-dead gorgeous. They have not depreciated a cent, and they have...
And I can't fit in them.
The roof does come off, but no, they solved all the packaging problems of the Solstice. You can actually fit more than a toothbrush in it if you want to get away for a weekend, and
now
they're
you can
very
put an
rare
electric
cars.
toothbrush in. They've doubled the size of the...
I have a question for you guys that was posed to me last week by a journalist, and I had to think long and hard about it. And a lot of the cars that we're talking about today seem to fall in the early 90s, 80s category, sometimes late 70s, where mileage really seems to be an important part of the discussion. If we have a Duesenberg, 1930, 31, 29, whatever it is, we're not generally talking about mileage unless it's an extremely original, well-preserved car where that condition is really commensurate with the mileage you see before you. So if we're talking about, Trans Ams and Firebirds and Ferrari 328s, what do you think constitutes low mileage? Is it less than 1,000 miles wrapped in a bubble in your garage, or is it less than 5,000? Does it depend on the mark? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think very few people actually have bubbles in their garage. So, you worry about ultra low mileage. But if you could find a car that's done 500 to 1,000 miles a year, I think that's the ideal situation. The car's been exercised, the fluids have been pushed through it. We all know that a car sitting, even in a bubble, is probably the worst thing for it. So if you get one that low mileage but shows some use, I think it's the ideal situation.
Yeah, and it's funny because as an appraiser, I get these calls all the time, and it will be about a 2004 car with just 60,000 miles on it, and I of course don't consider that a low miles car because we deal with cars in 2,000 and 3,000 and 4,000 mile ranges and that sort of thing too. But there is kind of getting back to something. Then you have the problem when you buy a 1,000 mile car or a 600 mile car. Do you drive it or do you put it away in a carcoon? And just make sure nobody ever touches it. And a lot of the value goes away if you put a lot of miles on it. But I agree with Myron, 500, 600 miles, 700 miles a year, something like that is probably really ideal for automobiles when it comes down to it. I mean, you're probably going to be happier with the 4,500 mile example than the 450 mile from a mechanical standpoint.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't think there's any fun in having a car where you feel like you're throwing a dollar bill out the window with every click of the odometer. But the same token, there are situations where you can find a freakishly low mileage example of a car that might not have turned your head otherwise, a 15,000 mile Lincoln Mark V. That's a pretty interesting thing. And if you pay $10,000 or $11,000 for it and you decide, well, I'm almost going to treat this like a new car and I'm going to drive this fairly regularly, it's not the same. I mean, you really don't feel like you're tossing a dollar bill out the window with every click of the odometer, and you can really enjoy something like that.
You look like you wanted to say something, Alan?
Oh, I completely agree.
Oh, okay. We're seeing that we're moving to the 80s and 90s, but what are the entry-level cars? It used to be that things like Mustang GTs, good entry-level car. Any Mustang, good entry-level. But how's that changing?
Fox body Mustangs. Dave has actually a great story about, I think you were at an AACA meet, and you were asking somebody if the Mustang would ever be collectible. And
Yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, back when dinosaurs were still walking around, my first Hershey event, AACA event, was probably 1972. And I really did. This is a true story. And asked one of the old guys there. He was probably 45. I mean, ready for the grave. And I'm looking at these rows and rows of Model Ts and Model As, and there's literally nothing there. The oddball would be a Chevy from the 20s, something like that. And I said, well, what about Mustangs? Will they ever be collectible? And his answer was, son, they built too many of them. Mustangs will never be collectible. And now you go to the AACA meet, and it's rows and rows and rows of Mustangs. I guess the point, or part of the point of that is, you know, it's hard to tell what's going to be the next collectible, but you can pretty well get in front of it if you want to. And there's a whole bunch of things that you can buy and not spend a lot of money
Yeah.
on as far as that goes. With emerging markets, when we're talking about newer collector cars, like I said, for most of us, we have to think a generation or two down.
Yeah, and the point of that was I've heard people say the same thing about Fox body Mustangs, that no, they will never be collectible. And whenever I hear somebody say that, I think that's going down a slippery slope, because you can never really predict what's going to appeal to the next generation. And Fox body Mustangs in particular, that along with third generation, Camaro IROC-Zs really kind of ended the malaise era. Sort of that era of lots of pollution equipment, very low horsepower, and not great performance that basically was roughly from 74 to 84. Over 200 horsepower for the first time, I think around 1985, and same thing with the IROC-Z. I mean, somebody should build a bronze statue to both cars, because they really sort of brought affordable V8 performance back to the masses. And I think those cars are particularly rare in good condition, and I think they've got a good future. I think Fox body Mustangs are already starting to show that. The parts and aftermarket ecosystem is springing up around them, and I think that it would be very hard to go wrong with a good GT or 5-liter LX Fox body Mustang, particularly with a manual transmission.
And this is the case in Myron. I'm sure you do a lot of this is probably eBay's number 300 shopper in the world, something like that, for automobiles. But you want to find things that haven't been kind of modified in any way, or if the modifications were done, they were done early on and kind of tastefully. It's really funny because a lot of times people think that commensurately with what they spend on accessories and options, aftermarket things on their car, it increases the value. But in fact, most of the time it decreases it. I mean, do you find that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. The lowest mileage, most original car you can find is great. Now, there's an exception for the JDM cars, because in Japan especially, it's kind of a badge of honor, the more custom touches you can make. And it's very crowded there. You don't get a chance to see a whole car, so everything has pedal pads or a steering wheel or a little thing stuck here and there. There'll be a Mitsubishi at the show tomorrow that has all kinds of period stickers that are key. But again, as David said, if it was done in period when they were new, if it was the thing to do, it's absolutely the way to go. And also, when we're talking about these emerging classics, you have to look at what your ultimate goal is with the car. The Fox body Mustangs, the first and second generation Celicas, they're going to be collectible. They're probably never going to be $1 million cars. But if you can buy a car, see general appreciation with it, and enjoy it and have fun with it, the value is every bit there. And I think that's kind of a bigger focus for me.
What I sometimes question as well is, as it relates to Fox body Mustangs, JDM cars and so forth, is how far are we going to take the analysis on these cars? I think the storyline for a lot of the last 4, 5, 6 years has been that collectors are doing a lot more homework in areas that generally didn't really used to matter before. Matching numbers on E-types, or original colors, are they really significant or not? Going so far to the point now where I think a barn find car, an extremely well-preserved car, all other factors being equal, generally speaking, might be worth more than a fully restored car, and the importance of factory-correct presentation. I suspect that with these cars from the 80s and 90s, that'll be true as well. People are going to put value on factory-correct presentation, showing the car exactly as left the factory, and I think the first indicator of that is that adding aftermarket parts to a car, even if it makes the car faster, seems to detract from the value. That's the first sign right there, in my opinion. And I think going beyond that, engine swaps, generally speaking, won't be desirable either. So I think if we can apply the same logic to a 66 Shelby Mustang as you can to a modern Shelby, that's probably pretty sound, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that, definitely. And I think you're going to see that too in sort of the rare models, like a 1993 Mustang Cobra R, which frankly, when I see those come to market, I still have a hard time believing how affordable those actually are, or say like a 97 Camaro SLP or something like that. The very rare variants of cars that were kind of common, I think, people are going to have the same really, microscopic eye applied to those cars that they're doing to cars from the 60s and 70s now. You just brought up Shelby again. The Hertz Shelby, the 2005 and 2006 Hertz cars, they got dumped on the market back in the day when they were a year and a half old or a year old,
and they were really cheap. They were $25,000 that you could buy literally at any auction around the country for about a year and a half. Now they're $45,000 and $55,000 cars, and they're wonderful cars. I mean, they're great cars to drive. I like the convertible better than the coupe, you know, just personal preference. But coupe's probably a better all-around car in terms of, you know, driving and handling. No cowl shake, which that car is kind of famous for. But you know, that's a car that was built in kind of limited quantity, as are most Shelbys. Also, the Celine cars. You know, always a good choice. They were kind of factory non-approved, but factory approved aftermarket suppliers, and so those cars were sold as brand new. You know, in Ford dealerships, you know, a good choice. But I'm going to circle back around to those Firebirds and Camaros. I really think that there's a lot of, you know, first of all, no one should be buying a car because they want to make money on it. You should buy a car because you love it. Yeah. And the making money on it's the icing on the cake. I mean, unless you're a car dealer, you should absolutely get what fits your lifestyle. You know, if you have something that you want to have the kids in the back seat, the grandkids in the back seat to go get an ice cream cone, you know, that sort of thing, that's what it should be all about. And the rest of it is kind of the making the smart decision versus kind of going with the crowd. And a lot of the times, you know, what the crowd says for the longest time isn't the best. I am not real high on the future of a lot of the non-special Porsches that have been going up in value incredibly. I mean, I like the last series turbo, makes a lot of sense on the 930, but there's a whole bunch of kind of very average 73 Porsches that seem to be going for, you know, twice average money. And I think, you know, when somebody wakes up and the music stops and there's an awful lot of Porsches that are circling around and not as many Porsche chairs, to use a really bad, you know, musical analogy, some people are going to fall on their butt.
Yeah.
You know, in that spirit of skepticism, I think there's one model that I'm constantly surprised by, and living in Detroit myself, I see it all the time. Grand Wagoneers. It's a great car.
Oh, no, it's
a
not.
lot of fun.
No,
I love
no,
it.
no, no, no. Whoa! I bought one new. 4,000 miles later, new engine.
Well, on that note, it's not a great car. But what I find amazing about it is how the value has risen. And I think there's an incredible popular appeal to those right now.
8 miles to the gallon.
As a lot of collector cars do.
Downhill with the wind.
Downhill with the wind?
No, it was a great looking car. I mean, seriously, but it was.
But its value is what doesn't make any sense to me at this
No,
point.
I know. Well, 25,000 doesn't make any sense to me on those cars.
Well, I've seen them
And-
for
and-
45 and
I know,
50,
and
yeah.
45, 50 is something that gets done. And mine was black with the red interior, the most desirable color. My wife, it was for my wife. She didn't like a sunroof, so we bought it without the sunroof. I paid $25,600 for it new. And I was, you know, it was like the boat ownership, the happiest 2 days, the day I bought it and the day I sold it.
Yeah, and by the way, it's 6 miles per gallon with the 4 golden retrievers on board.
Right, exactly. And, you know, yeah, they're great for they're great for Nantucket. They're great for
Well, in
the
in
Hamptons.
In that respect, I think
And
it's a bit
Grosse
of a,
Pointe, I guess, right? So,
there it is. I think in that respect, it's a bit of a fad, and I wonder how long it's really going to last. The same might be true of. It falls in the same category as maybe Land Rover Defenders. They've got a bit of a cult following, and I'm thinking the same thing may be true of SLs from the 80s, Mercedes SLs. You see quite a few of them, and you've still got your little old lady that has it parked in her garage for a number of years. You know, 560 SL. It's a big motor. It's going up in value. But I'm curious as to how long that's really going to sustain itself and whether that can be attributed not to a lasting collectible and more of a temporary fad.
You know, I think you find that like different spurs offshoots with a lot of those different things. And a lot of times you see market leaders. It happened with the 2000 GTs. You know, that market was controlled domestically for a long time by 2 or 3 dealers who decided to keep that market there, and they did it very successfully. I know the Wagon Master has done a good job with the Grand Wagoneers.
Yeah.
Right now, Jonathan Ward at Icon, out in California, is doing it with the Toyota FJs. I'm just selling FJs for $100,000 plus. And it's
Not
just-
anymore.
They're horrible cars.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think we've talked a lot about cars in the 80s and the 90s.
Trucks.
As being emerging. Exactly. And the one really bright spot in terms of emerging markets from the 60s and 70s are pickup trucks. Chevy C10 pickups from the mid to late 60s through the early 70s are really hot right now. Dave, I'm curious to hear if you think that that's, you know, here to stay, or if that's another fad.
Well, I'm going to do the appraiser thing. Trucks have value in use more than cars. You can justify a truck purchase if you live in, like I do, in a semi-rural area, and we have to take our trash into the dump every every Saturday. If you had that party where you had shrimp on Monday night and you're going in on Saturday, you're not putting that bag in the interior of your car, no matter how bad it is. So, I see more and more vintage pickup trucks, and it's so funny to say vintage cars that were built when I was a full-on adult as vintage, but C10 trucks, it's hard. As a Ford guy, it's very hard to argue the beauty of the C10. It is and in a short bed, it is a absolutely gorgeous truck. And I think those values, it has more. It has the utilitarian value of being a truck. And no one hates you when you drive a pickup truck. You're never going to get the middle finger salute like you might in some cars, including things like Corvettes, because trucks have always been affordable until now. I mean,
Dave's statement is absolutely true. It just kind of an offshoot. I've got a 914 Porsche that was made into a pickup truck in the 70s. They made a couple of them, and you know what? I don't get the typical Porsche driver response when I drive that thing.
914 Amino, right?
Yeah,
Exactly. So, yeah. And so, I mean, there's a lot of choices, and since it came up, I bought 2 El Caminos new in the '80s, and the company that I worked for, I had a company car, so I went with the El Camino. They're not very powerful. I had problems with some of the components on it. I think I replaced two trucks with 4 power windows. I think I replaced 4 power window motors per car. But once we got little things like that straightened out, El Camino's a gorgeous truck. I mean, they're trucks, they're cars and trucks, and they're a little bit of both. But I'd say finding once again unmodified ones, is a tough thing.
Yeah. Do you think the specification in that case, because there's a lot of those trucks that have a lot of high horsepower versions, big block Chevys in them, and so on and so forth. I mean, how much does that matter in relation to the car's presentation? Because as a truck, it's a utilitarian piece, and it's going to get worked on, it's going to get beat up and everything and so forth. Is it really the spec, the motor, or is it the condition? Or could you even divide the two?
Well, I think you have to go back to the '70s to worry about motor choices, because by the mid '80s there was nothing. There was just the V6.
There were no LS5.
I don't think there were a lot of motor choices in those. So yeah, it's all about condition and mileage. And let's talk mileage. Let's go back around to what we were talking about. Those internets have changed everything. Everybody can do their research, and everybody knows about cars from the '80s and '90s, and mileage becomes very, very important. I don't necessarily agree with all that. I have, everybody lives by, the god of Carfax.
Carfax, yeah.
And Carfax is not always right. I mean, I've been able to see that a number of different times. It's a good indicator, but mileage becomes important on cars that were 17-digit cars, 17-digit VIN cars, and cars that existed in an era when rolling back an odometer was against a federal law. A '60s car existed in a time when there was no Carfax, when there was no 17-digit VIN, and rolling back odometers was done on a daily basis, if not an hourly basis, at every used car shop in the country.
And they all had 5 digits
And
instead of 6.
my favorite are the '63 through '7 Corvettes that all have between 32,000 and 37,000 original miles. That's because that's when the little plastic gear on the odometer broke, guys. I mean, that's the reason why they all had 32,000 miles. So you have to do your research, and it's a great boon that we now are able to do research online. But once again, we just found a car that sold at an auction, and it's all over the internet about the price of the car, and it was a no sale for 1/3 that price. Somebody reported it, and then other people. Now this was an '80s auction. Now the information is much better, but somebody had made a mistake on it. So kind of trust but verify, the same sort of thing.
I do think it's going to change the landscape of what research is going to be like in the coming decades, because there is such a strong digital record of this stuff now. When we sell cars from the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, our research team is generally reaching out to former owners, relatives of owners, trying to find out as far back as we can with period photographs. It's a very laborious process, especially if you're trying to find out if the car was ever in an accident, or if it was ever, in fact, a low mileage car from the start, how many owners had it. But now that Carfax is really involved, we've had the same challenges as well. It isn't always right. It might indicate a much more severe incident than there was in the first place. But that digital record is going to continue now for years to come. online advertisements are probably going to be, you can still find ads for those cars for years to come. And so I think it'll be interesting in 20 years from now, as you look back on these Firebirds and Fox Body Mustangs and so forth, how the really great examples might even be rarer than the really great examples might have been of a 69 Camaro back in the 60s. There'll just be fewer of them that qualify as great cars.
And circling back around to mileage, I think we've all rented a car with 4,500 miles that was falling apart and driven the same thing with 100,000 miles that has been well taken care of, that's a much better car. So, I mean, don't worship the god of mileage all the time. I am aware, I'll just, there was an Acura that I was working on not too long ago in a valuation dispute, and it had a salvage title. Well, salvage title, that's a bad thing. Everybody knows salvage title, it's been in a major accident, it's been in a fire, it's been underwater in the Atlantic Ocean or something. This particular car, jealous lover, knife, interior, slashed the interior on the car. The car was totaled because it needed a new interior. That's my kind of salvage car. I'll drive the wheels off of that one because there's really was nothing wrong with the car except for the guy had the wrong girlfriend.
Yeah.
I don't think his wife appreciated it.
Yeah, the only problem with that is the documentation, because that is the story of virtually every salvage title car. And every ad you see, it's like, yes, it's got a salvage title, but a seat was ripped, or it was stolen, it was gone for a half a day and recovered, or something like that. You almost never see the cars, salvage titles, that were where the ad will fess up to the fact that it was an artificial reef in the Atlantic Ocean for 5 years.
If there are mushrooms growing out of the carpet,
Yeah.
you probably can figure
bad
out
sign.
that it's been underwater, though. So.
What's the opinion on all the emissions equipment back in the 70s and the 80s on the vehicles, and what to do about that, if any?
Do you mean,
Depends
do you
on-
leave it?
Yeah, it depends on where you live. If you live in California or Oregon, then you absolutely need to keep it. I think they've got a rolling 25-year exemption in Oregon, and I think it's, straight 1974. No, it's straight 1974, I think, in California and Oregon. You absolutely have to have it in place. It has to function, and you have to smog the car. So if you live someplace else and you don't need to have it on and you decide to remove it, you absolutely need to keep it. Otherwise, you're limiting the market for that car when you sell it.
Yeah, you just, if you're running without it, if it's not required, that's your choice. But don't ever throw any of that stuff away. That's the stuff that has become, and we've all talked to restorers who are doing cars, especially from the late 60s and early 70s, those air pumps that are
Smart
worthless.
pumps are more valuable than...
Absolutely, they don't do anything to make the car run better. They just make it run worse, but they're as valuable as gold because everybody threw them away.
And there's nothing wrong with removing them and using it, making the car more usable, as long as, like the guy said, you save it and put it away.
Why are they so valuable? To go to the states that need to have...
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. But also for restorations, it should be correct. The underhood should be correct if you're going to show the car. So that it kind of completes they become the hardest to find parts. That completes the circle. So, that's the reason why. And, I'll give you a great example. When I was a kid, I knew a mechanic who had a very, very large toolkit that would have fallen over all the time. But what he put in the bottom drawer, the entire bottom drawer, was fuel pumps from fuel injections from Chevrolets that he removed in the 50s and 60s. And I assume that when he moved to Florida, he threw that stuff away. Now they're more precious than gold, but they couldn't get the cars to run with those fuel pumps back in the day, so they took them off, and he used it actually as weight.
Good example is I recently sold a 1968 Porsche 912.
You sold a car?
Yeah, believe it or not. Don't tell my wife. But that 68 Porsche, their way with dealing with emissions in 68 was they put this smog pump. It's a one-year-old. It was the worst idea. It sapped all the power of the car. Well, I just sold it, and the thing that the guy that bought it was most interested in, does it have the smog pump? And fortunately, this car did have it, so I should have kept it. But
I think the same is true of a lot of bells and whistles that come with car when they're sold new. And for us as an auction house, it's always challenging to source some of those parts if the car doesn't have them still. Some of them are pretty generic and apply to all cars. Owner's manuals in some cases are extraordinarily rare. All the bells and whistles that you get when you walk out of a dealership, and it takes an extra 3 square feet of space in your garage to hold on to it. Every car that I've ever bought, even if it's the most insignificant piece, I always recommend holding on to it because, as you say, years later, it's almost impossible to source. And I think the most extreme example of that is in the Ferrari market, which is, as you know, a large chunk of the collector car business. And you've got tool rolls, owner's manuals, some of those parts going into the tens of thousands of dollars because they are that unobtainable.
Yeah, and it's a major knock on a car, even a relatively affordable Ferrari, if it doesn't have the books, the owner's manuals, the warranty book, and all that stuff, and a full tool roll. It's a major knock on value.
You need to, no matter what the car, you need to keep the complete history of it now. That wasn't as important 20 years ago. It was kind of odd 20 years ago when everybody would have all their receipts and all the history of the car. And interestingly, as the car gets older, sometimes a bad history becomes part of its great history. Obviously with race cars, they get shunted all the time. They're in all kinds of accidents. They have things happen to them, and that's generally accepted with cars like that. But with a lot of cars, kind of the original owner who was an eccentric who kept blankets over it and all that sort of stuff becomes a really important part of the history of the why this car existed, when it existed, and how it was treated, by previous owners.
By the same token, I think we also need to be careful about the way that cars are analyzed by people that are experts, quote unquote, in that particular field or mark. And I'd say every imaginable car model, regardless of its age, has an expert in it, a specialist in it, a concours field you can be judged on. But generally speaking, I think we need to remember as well that it's very difficult to find a clear path as to the way things were built on a car in period. So if everyone accepts that 99 out of 100 Ford Mustangs from the mid-'80s had a certain part on it, and one particular car doesn't, but the original owner insists that it was born that way, I think we need to be very careful that just because we have enough examples of a certain rule that we don't assume that the factory always did it that way. I think it's especially true in earlier cars, or if there was an extra part available and it fit on the car, you threw it on.
Or smaller manufacturers, like a TVR would be a great example. I once talked to Peter Morgan, and I had a friend who had bought a Morgan new, and it didn't have Lucas lights and equipment on it. And I asked him about it. He says, yeah, we couldn't afford to pay the bill to Lucas. I mean, that's the reason why. I was at the Avanti factory in 1984, and they'd run out of headlights, and their normal source, I think, was Walker. And Steve Blake reached into his wallet and gave the kids some money. He ran across the street to Napa to get headlights. They need to ship the car.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. Things change, and sometimes, especially with the smaller manufacturers, or the mid-model changes that come up that people aren't aware of, or the first 17 down the line got this, or whatever. So there's always exceptions to those rules.
Yeah, it illustrates the point. This is not a hobby of absolutes. There are a lot of gray areas. Just like we said earlier, anytime you go down the slippery slope of saying, well, X car will never be collectible, if you say categorically, well, that is absolutely not correct, that's not right, you really are opening yourself up to be proven wrong a lot of the time. It's better just to say, well, maybe that's not typical, or I haven't seen it that way before, but it's just not a hobby of absolutes.
Unless you own a Corvette.
We've talked a lot of, oh, I'm sorry.
Question out there?
We've heard a lot about 80s cars emerging, but mostly American. I'd like to hear what the panel has to say about European cars from the 80s, like rookie rally cars, special outfits.
Wow, sure.
Rally cars emerged, or are they still emerging?
I think they've emerged. I mean, the Ford RS 2000s, that was an amazing, very dangerous series, and what they gained the reputation of being the killer bees, and I think that train is definitely left the station.
I think you're right, but I think the American buyer hasn't completely opened up to some of those really, really rare special cars that do exist out there. I consider, for instance, a Elantra Delta Integrale. You rarely see them in the States. I don't believe they were sold here new.
No.
But I do believe that is a car that once a few do finally arrive here, it could be a boom very similar to the Alcosca or the Skylines, the 2000 GTs, and so forth.
Absolutely, and that's starting to happen with the 25-year rule. An Integrale just showed up on Bring a Trailer the other day.
Right.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So for right now, I think to most American buyers, it probably looks just like a Volkswagen GTI. And our company, as an example, has a lot of specialists that live and work in Europe and the ones that live and work here in the States. And there's a clear distinction between what they appreciate and what they know and drive every day and what they grew up with. The same is true of our auctioneers. So I think that the U.S. is starting to wake up to it, but we're far from complete exposure in a lot of very special models.
Yeah, and you mentioned Alpha earlier. If there were an 80s Alpha that I would buy right now, I'd probably try to find a Callaway GTV6 twin turbo.
Jag XJS, always a great choice right now. They built quite a few of them. Most all of them came to the American market. They have the typical Jag build quality problems, but
The Ford ones were better, though.
pardon me?
The post-Ford
Yeah.
buyout ones were better.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's some great bargains in those cars if you can find one that, once again, has come from a good climate and has been taken care of.
Yeah, even the special editions like the XJRS or
Oh,
the,
yeah, absolutely, yeah. There's a lot of things that are, and they're still relatively cheap in the in the Jag market.
And
so.
there are a couple of special ones, a few 5-speed XJSs with the 6-cylinder slip through the U.S. Those are pretty interesting, and strangely enough, they built a convertible XJS, everybody knows that, but Hess and Eisenhart, the coach builder here in the U.S., started converting them before the factory did them. The Hess and Eisenhart cars are actually prettier and fairly rare.
We had a question?
You talk about importing European cars, gray market cars. How about Thailand like that? Is it difficult? The car's never been approved. EPA.
Florida, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Georgia. But
Yeah.
no, if the car's 25 years or older, it's no problem. You're exempt from everything, unless you're in California.
Yeah, and in that point, they have to pass the smog requirements for whatever that year was. The only problem there is with some of the cars that are on the radar of the federal government, and those cars are things like Mini Coopers, Rover-built Mini Coopers, that people in many cases will bring in cars that are newer than 25 years old, but they're masquerading as cars that are older, and Land Rover Defenders. And those are the two cars that are really on the radar of the government, and you have to be absolutely certain that what you're buying, even if you have no intent to deceive, if you've been deceived by the seller with cars like that, very often the recourse is they'll confiscate and crush the car. And there are videos on YouTube of just that going on.
And keep in mind, with a lot of the German cars, they get sent out of market because they can't pass the German inspection, which is extremely rigorous. And so when you see one of those, you really have to do a lot of work, because there could be a lot of hidden problems in terms of rust repair. especially on those
Absolutely.
cars.
Make sure it's got a TUV, or if you're buying something out of the UK, an MOT. They're really rigorous inspections, and if you've got one on a car that's current,
make sure no matter
that's a
what,
big deal.
there's 3 initials you don't understand after it. That would be great.
And there's also don't fall into the trap buying a car from Canada thinking that if it's titled in Canada we should be able to bring it over because it's only an hour away.
It's the 51st state.
That's right. They have a 15-year rule, and cars that are titled over there that might be totally legal over there won't be legal here till they're 25.
We had a question, second row.
We've had some discussion today on air-cooled Porsches, and like the 300 SL price point, that got to the point where it became out of reach for a lot of people, and then the 190s took off.
Yeah.
So like the air-cooled Porsches, do you think that we'll hit a point where some portions of the 944 and
Absolutely.
the 968 will?
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's funny, it was in my notes to bring that up. I know a lot of people who are buying 996 turbos right now, the first of the water-cooled turbos, because they are underneath, they're kind of 5 or 6/8 of a 959. They're fantastic cars and don't have the reliability issues of a normal 996, and you can still buy one in the 30s, which is crazy. But yeah, the 944s, I'm still amazed at how inexpensive, first year an 83 944 low miles is. I think the 944 turbos, which tended to be tracked and abused and used harder, I think they have a very good future. And the 968 was probably one of the best front engine Porsches that's ever been, and it's comparatively rare, and that car is overlooked right now. So I think there's a very good future there.
928s as well, the early ones, the late ones
Yeah.
especially. The what do you call it? Pasha interior on the early ones.
That ship is sailing. As
Yeah.
of right now, there is a 78 first year 928 with that crazy checked op art interior. last time I looked, it was at 18.5. It'll probably finish over 20, and it was not that great of a car. A year and a half ago, it would have struggled to make $12,000.
Yeah, they've definitely come into their own. And keep in mind, a 928, historically, it was more expensive than a 911, and it was the future of Porsche that didn't happen. We said no to the front-engine air-cooled 928 and yes to the 911. So I mean, that's a car that I think engineering-wise is a superior car in many ways.
And if you look at even the 924s, if you look at the very special 924s, the Carrera GTs, the GTRs, those are high dollar cars now. Those are trading $500,000 to $700,000. So if it can do that on those cars, it's just a matter of time.
Yeah, dare I say Boxsters have a future too. I mean, it's kind of unusual because they were widely, well, let's face it, with Porsches, they love to kill their kids. I mean, they love to just say the newest one is the best one, and then it takes a long time to build up and come back. And so, some of the, always think contrarian. When the experts tell you, that car will never be worth any money, always remember that, the world is full of those people. Right here, many years ago, I was writing for Sports Car Market, and I wrote up a Togo Brown 356, what was it, 356C?
It's a C, yeah.
And sold at RM Auctions, and I wrote it up as a great buy and a wonderful car at $24,000. Well, you pretty much add a 1 to that right now, and that'd be close to what the price is. And somebody else at SCM, who was the Porsche expert, said, "Car will never be worth anything, and who'd want a car in Togo Brown?" Well, now people are looking for the oddball colors, and they like that. And when they introduced the new Mini, it came out in hot cocoa, which, by the way, is Togo Brown. So.
I think the same is probably true of Porsche in its earliest days. The 356 Speedster, when you look at it, its outfitting and everything else, the price point at which it was sold, it's extraordinary where it sits now value-wise compared to the Cabriolet D or compared to some other really wonderful examples that they made in the 356 series. So sometimes I do think that the collector car industry is a little counterintuitive. Some things don't always make a whole lot of sense. And a front-engine Porsche, as unusual as that is, I think has a lot of legs. I think it just takes a bit of time for greater appreciation to catch up to that.
We have about 5 minutes before we turn over to the floor. And I had one question I wanted to pose to some of you. As these markets emerge, are there particular markets that you see contracting where cars are becoming harder to move, where the interest is really moving away? Alan, can we start with you?
I'd say that the two segments that we see that are, I shouldn't say use the word contract because I think they've always been holding very steady, are 50s American convertibles and classics. So the traditional American cars that we see, they're very solid buys, and the reason I like those is because they're not skyrocketing in scary ways in the same way that some Ferraris and air-cooled Porsches are. And Dave made an excellent point earlier. Some of the Porsches that are going up in value are skyrocketing so quickly that it scares you a bit as to whether there's any bedrock below that.
There's not.
Right. But I would say that with regard to American classics, they've been holding extremely steady for many years. And so I wouldn't say it's a contraction. Certainly the demographic for those cars is slightly older than it would be for some of the cars we've been discussing today in the emerging markets. But I view them as a solid choice for somebody who's not taking a gamble or, again, buying a car simply on speculation, which you shouldn't do in the first place. I think the 50s and 60s convertibles, the big kind of fins and chrome eras is probably fits in that category.
Yeah. I think the same thing's happening on the European side, too. If you look at E-types, I got this completely wrong. I really never thought you'd see $250,000, $400,000, and even $500,000 E-types. They made a lot of them. They're doing really well, but if you go back to the 50s, the XK120, the 140, and the 150, they've been holding steady for a very long time.
And, you had brought up the 300 SL and the 190. I just wanted to say something about that. 300 SL's prices have been contracting recently, and there's a really good reason why, I think, on those cars. So many, here's what happened. A whole bunch of people had them, they thought of them as $300,000 cars. Forever they were, $300,000, $400,000 cars. All of a sudden, we start seeing one that sells for over $1 million at your sale in Phoenix, and the market boomed. They went crazy. People restored them, and a lot of people put them on the market. Why? Because they're 70 years old. They didn't know their asset was worth $1 million. They certainly hadn't borrowed that much against it. More importantly, their wife found out that they had an asset that was worth $1 million. And all of a sudden, that house in Scottsdale becomes very, very affordable. And so many of them came on the market, and so many of them were restored at the same time, it depressed the price. Last year at Monterey, I don't remember the number, but it was something like 15, 17 300 SLs.
19 was the number.
19, thank you. 300, yeah, it must have hurt. 300 SLs, both coupes and convertibles, came on the market, and the price actually went down. We had to lower the price in our price guide, and we're actually lowering the price again on the 3s and 4s, the kind of lesser cars, because that's what happens with markets. It can't absorb 125 300 SLs coming on the market in 1 year, and when it does, then there are more cars to look at, and that happens with a lot of cars.
I think you just touched on a really interesting point about what can the market absorb, and a lot of the storylines, a lot of the sizzle that you see in car magazines and so forth relates to multi-million-dollar transactions. Ferrari selling for $25, $30 million. But truth be told, there aren't many collectors that have a really die-hard interest in cars at that price point, and can afford them certainly, and are interested in racing a multi-million-dollar Ferrari. So I think it's extremely difficult to draw conclusive market trends at that price point when the market is so small. But when we're talking about some of the cars we've been dealing with today, they're transacted so regularly at hundreds of auctions around the world and sold privately with regularity that I think you can really draw a very conclusive price and say, yes, that car should be worth $10,000, $15,000. They're sold all day long. But to draw a conclusion on a car in the price points that we're talking about right now, 7 figures, there aren't many of them trading annually. They're in the 2 digits in our particular case. And yeah, I think it's just harder to draw concrete evidence from that.
Yeah, and despite what you might think when you see things in the media, the list of $1 million cars is not all that long. I don't think there's more than $600 million cars that have sold at public auction. It's 600 cars. I mean, there are 600 cars in the parking lot out there. I mean, to give you some sort of example. So, I mean, it's pretty interesting. They do grab all the headlines. But I don't think they should, but it's interesting reading, but that's not what real people can afford.
And to follow up on Alan's comment about the classic market steady and contracting a bit, there are opportunities in there too, even though the top end of the market has been steady, hasn't been increasing over the years. There are cars like the coach-built Lincolns and the coach-built Chryslers from the classic era that never got the respect that the Packards and the other cars got. And I've seen in the last year or two, the Lincolns and the Chryslers getting more respect, and those values have grown proportionately higher than any other car in that market.
Yeah, and that's a really good point too, because I mean there are cars that buck the trend. I mean, speaking of cars that never got respect, Studebakers from the 50s and 60s. The notion that you would see a 6-figure Golden Hawk or something like that 10 years ago, I think you said you're nuts. But I mean, those cars seem to be bucking the general trend of 50s cars being pretty stable. I mean, the Raymond Loewy, the Starlight Coupes, and those cars are actually doing quite well.
Gentlemen, we're going to have to stop our discussion portion, but we're going to open it to the floor in just a second. I want to thank all of you, Myron, Dave, Al, and Rob, and now we're going to open it to the floor. Do we have a microphone to go out there? Thank you, Andy.
Hi, what do you feel of Smokey and the Bandit Trans Ams or second generation Trans Ams in general?
I actually went on the first of the Smokey and the Bandit runs about 11 years ago, something like that. I have never had more fun per square inch than driving that event from Texas to Georgia. I think they're great cars. They're not particularly powerful cars, but they're easy cars to wrench on. If mine was a black one with gold, it had the cloth interior, which I would get the vinyl if I had a choice, and I'd definitely get the T-tops because that's the whole package. When I bought the car, I paid $8,900 for it. When I sold it, I got $18,000 for it, and right now to replace it would be easily $28,000 for that same car in that condition, or maybe even more. So they have appreciated quite a bit. I mean, it is like driving a cartoon. cartoon. I get that in a lot of ways, but I had more fun per square inch and met some of the nicest and best people I've ever met in my life on that run. So, you know, as far as that goes, it was a real car with a real experience, and I'll never, ever forget it, and I'd have another one in a minute.
Yeah, and the next generation of Black Firebird, too, you've got people who grew up watching Knight Rider and who remember Kit really well. I think the future is bright for those cars, too.
Yeah.
Wonder if you'd comment on the second bounce cars. I think this weekend there was at least 13 Model A's that are for sale, the state sales around, and they're kind of depressed on the market, but you put a crate V8 in those things and they double or triple in value, and I was wondering if you'd comment on whether that's a sustainable market there for those second bounce cars.
I'll take it if no one else wants it. Yeah, I mean, you know, asking $25,000, we'll take $15,000 has been the Model T, kind of Model A, you know, price range for a long, long time for non-special cars. When you do modifications to cars, they become a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And that's good for 10 years, but for 10 years after that, it's going to be a period piece from 2015. And so that market becomes limited. I would just say that's all about having fun. And you know, you're absolutely right. You can spend a little and make a lot more on those cars when you do that to it. There are some that would say it's a sin to do something like that to cars. I don't necessarily agree with that. Especially for cars when, you know, there's still a great number of them out there. But I would say, number one, it's all about having fun with those.
Yeah, you know, the classic hot rod market has been very, very strong lately, but these are cars that, you know, have great provenance, that's fully documented and haven't been
Classic
modified.
hot rods, yeah. Huge.
Ma'am?
You mentioned about the history of cars being very important, of course, and I have a 74 Buick LeSabre Sport Coupe and a 75 Buick LeSabre convertible. And my story of history is that these belong to my husband, who was Mr. Grey Poupon, Gerald Cooper. So I want to know where the best place would be for me to market a product that has this history.
I think they're all looking right at me clearly, because obviously an auction would be the best place to market. I think, to your point, a lot of what drives, and we talked about sizzle earlier. I think history in that regard is also not just the fact that your husband owned it, but I think also the fact that it's been in the same family for a long time. So irrespective of who the owner was, I think it gives a certain degree of satisfaction to knowing where the car was its entire life, and presumably there are records to go along with that. You know, all bias aside, I do think that every medium of collector car transaction has its merit, and records are set privately on eBay, at car clubs, and of course at auction. I think a lot of what you see at auction is really primarily a captive audience, 400 or 500, even 1,000 people in one room who have all expressed interest in a car, and it's a very real, instantaneous transaction that takes place in 90 seconds or so.
Yeah, and these are cars that people are taking a second look at now, too. The last of the GM full-size cars. We mentioned earlier that Dave and I were talking about sort of the phenomenon of the Goodfellas-era Cadillacs, you know, sort of your early 70s full-size DeVilles and Fleetwoods are gaining a following of people who don't remember them new, but are probably really big fans of Martin Scorsese films.
Yeah, I would emphasize that what you need to do very quickly is write the story of the car. Write the story of both cars. And you know the story. You don't have to be a professional writer, but people love reading about the history of automobiles. And now, you know, you don't have to buy a column inch in Hemmings, although that works, works quite well. But you can also go online with Hemmings, for example, and you can have a 700-word story or a 2,000-word story, and it's not going to cost you any more because digital space is basically free. Thank you.
Hi, going back to the emerging collectible cars, the late 80s, 85 to 90, that are all in that 25 to 30-year-old range now. Any quirky, unusual cars that are pennies on a dollar right now that somebody can get into the hobby and expect to be interesting later on?
Let me repeat that so that the online people can hear that. Quirky cars from the 80s, 90s that are catching on.
SVO Mustang, Subaru SVX, Mark I Volkswagen Scirocco, Audi GT Coupe. The list goes on of cars that are really pennies on the dollar. 1988 Fiero GTs, as Dave said, GM gets it right, they kill it. But fantastic cars. You know, even weirder, a car that might appeal to Myron is a very late Isuzu Impulse Turbo. I mean, there are tons and tons of interesting $5,000 and under quirky cars out there. You can buy one that's not a wreck, it's not a project, it's a nice, done car ready to go and enjoy. It's just hit Craigslist.
Yeah, and just again, focus on buying the best example you possibly can.
Yeah, there are, like the Dodge Viper, there is probably one WRX out there that is, you know, from that era that's still nice. They were bought by kids, they were driven as daily transportation, they were abused. They were tracked, everything else, but you know, somewhere a pilot bought one and he's kept meticulous records, and when I find that car, I'm going to buy it and pay too much money for it.
Yeah,
So,
you know, it took me about 30 years to learn the lesson about don't let the low price temptation get to you. It still gets to me once in a while.
I haven't learned that lesson yet. So.
We have room for time for two more, so please.
William Hopper, Mercedes-Benz Club of America, Star Magazine. Question for you on the bubble. With the proliferation of all these reality shows about cars and car collecting, everybody seems to now think that they're a car expert. And is that affecting the market at all? And will there be a bubble that'll burst because of that?
I think it's a question that came up most prominently last year around the same time as we were going into Monterey. And I think the bubble, that conversation, again, I think came about because of the multi-million-dollar cars that were selling for massive amounts of money. And they were leapfrogging each other, it seemed, every month with a car that was $5, $6, $7 million, all of a sudden was 9 or 10. I firmly believe, and I think it's open for discussion certainly, that this isn't indicative of a bubble that happened a couple decades ago or even more now. I think there is plenty of bedrock beneath us, and I think some of the cars that have no sale at auction, or some of the cars that failed to meet their reserves, as aggressive as they were, have proven that. A lot of times what happens in the auction business is that if an E-Type, for instance, sets a record at $400-some thousand, a lot of collectors that have similar cars will assume, well, gosh, mine is fractionally even better, and mine should be worth $500,000. Well, the truth is that $400,000 instance was likely a blip on a radar. It was a fluke, and it was related to 2 or 3 people in a room that really wanted that car. The fact that those prices have leveled off slightly, they haven't tanked, but they've really leveled off, I think signifies to me that there should be really no fear of a bubble bursting.
Well, we've seen in the price guide, for example, we've seen a lot of cars that were going at 12% every 3 months. That'd be 30%, 36% appreciation, have gone down to 4 and 5%. I still say there's potential for some cars with major retractions. Those cars that went up the most, Rob and I have talked about this. We think an awful lot of smart money got out of the market in 2014.
Yeah.
We're talking about for $1 million and up cars now, or cars that are close to $1 million. But it remains to be seen. I still think there's a lot of air in the market. I think that there's room for some expansion. But I don't think this would be a bad time to to diversify into more and better cars as opposed to just having all your eggs in one basket.
You know, it's been mentioned a couple times up here before. Buy the cars you love, enjoy them. Don't buy them again unless you're a dealer for investment purposes. Obviously, there's a lot more opportunity to get educated, to get smart about the cars, and you'll never make a bad investment.
We have a final question.
What do you see as the collectability of the electrified and computerized cars of the 2000s, 20 years from now, when there are no more dealers that have equipment to service them, and the technology isn't in the hobby to take care of these cars? Will there be a point at which the cars drop off as being collectibles?
That is a great question, and it illustrates what Dave and I have called the BMW 850i effect. And those are fantastic cars. They're beautiful 12-cylinder coupes, but they are incredibly complex electronically. Very early versions of some electronics and engine management systems that were being pioneered then. They seem to have 2 of everything. And they are not bringing very good money right now, in spite of the fact that they're really desirable cars. And I think for that reason, I think the junkyards of the future are going to hold a lot of cars with pristine bodies, nice interiors, but are economically beyond repair because of the electronics.
I think there's one very notable outlier to that, and those are supercars that are being built by manufacturers in limited quantities. They're generally preparing, we're selling a number of them in Monterey this year, and they're generally prepared in such a way that the factory continues maintenance for them for years to come because it's very lucrative for them. One very expensive and very large outlier would be McLaren. They've been servicing these cars since the 90s, and they continue to do so and make a great deal of money on it. Bugatti is another example of that. But those are maybe a few thousand cars a year that fit that bill. The rest of them, I think we have the same concern. I think certain advances in automotive technology or in restoration technology like 3D printing is going to help really early cars. But as far as technological whizzes that are going to be maintaining those cars for years to come, I'm not sure.
Yeah, when the iDrive on your 2001 7 Series goes out, and 3D printing is probably not going to be your your savior there.
It's all about the economics. If it becomes economically viable for somebody to rebuild the car, it's going to be done. If a person built it, a person can fix it. In terms of the electronics on the cars from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, I've seen people who've restored cars from those eras, and what they've done is they've used current electronics. So behind the facade of the dashboard, something like that, is something that is much more current. So, I'm skeptical that, there will be a problem, and I understand that, but I think once again, it's all about the economics. Just circling back around to the 996, 3 weekends ago at Cars and Coffee, I had a 35-year-old expert who told me that 996s will never be collectible because they've got a solid block, and when they go, they're gone forever. And I said, I wish I was going to live another 30 years and could make a $10,000 bet with him, because they will be collectible. They're already starting to be collectible, and they will retain that, because at some point rebuilding those parts as the overall value of the car is just another another facet of the ownership. So people can fix things, and they always will be able to fix things, whether it's through 3D printing or just good old American ingenuity.
If the market's worthwhile, there's going to be, where there's a will, there's a way, and that's, I think, a current...
No, where there's a will, there's a lawsuit, right?
That's right, whatever. But, a current example of that would be like the Mazda Cosmo. Parts for that car, for that engine have been unobtainable for 20 years, but they've seen a huge run-up in value in the last 2 years.
Well, gentlemen, we want to thank you. We've got to wind this one up and make room for our factory drag car seminar. Rob, Alan, Dave, Myron, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you for coming and being a terrific audience with great questions.